Hello everyone, and welcome to my presentation titled Reviewing Our Relationships with the World, Foundations for Decolonial and Equitable English Language Learning. Quick overview to this presentation. I'll first start by introducing myself and positioning myself, and then giving some background to this conceptual paper presentation. I'll then identify the problem, our inequitable colonial Western monolingual and monocultural classrooms. I'll then dive a little bit more into the theoretical background and the historical context, and then envisage what it can look like moving forward into practice by decolonizing the English classroom and the past, present, and future of our learners through heritage language pedagogy. I'll introduce the Transferable Learning Circle and the World Reviewer log, and then I will round off today's presentation with some key takeaways and implications for decolonizing language education and ways in which we can carry forward the conversation by giving some examples of forthcoming and recent publications on this topic. So, who am I? Is Misha Palmi Chibolo, Shegela Hanum, Hamir Glasgow Anon Alaba, Shelena Hanum and McGill University, Montreal, Sma Ur Konyacha. So I introduce myself in my language, Scottish Gaelic. In English, my name is Paul Megan Chibolo. I'm a Scottish Gael from Glasgow, Scotland, a PhD candidate and Shirk Scholar at McGill University, Montreal in the Department of Integrated Studies in Education. And it's really nice to be talking with you all today. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge this land, the plants, water, animals, and spirits. For thousands of years, Toronto has been the traditional land and territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I'd just like to say I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to work and to live on this land. So some reasons for my research is informed by personal experiences of the harms of colonization on Indigenous and heritage languages in the UK and Scotland and on Turtle Island, or what is now known as North America. For example, my language, Scottish Gaelic, when I was going through the educational system in Glasgow, it was never offered as a core subject or an elective, for example, and the language itself is still not recognized as quote unquote official in the United Kingdom. And since marrying and meeting and marrying my Anishinaabe husband in Glasgow, I've learned more about the devastating impacts of colonization on the Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island. This has driven me to think of ways in which we can enact more equitable education and language policy, and my research focuses on Indigenous language revitalization and decolonizing language education. So during the presentation, certain views expressed are my own, and certain constructs such as Western or Indigenous are used as the common expressions in the dominant Western or binary way of viewing and constructing the world. However, worldviews and cultures are not static, and not all Western or Indigenous experiences are the same. So some background to this conceptual paper presentation. The ideas for it first started to emerge in 2019 for an English for academic purposes class at a college in Toronto. I was teaching a quote unquote upper intermediate level there. And it was a content-based 8-week course on the topic of the environment. The problem that I found, and this is a recurring problem, is that the vast majority of texts were written from a dominant Western perspective, and a monocultural and monolingual, quote unquote, white standard native English speaker perspective was portrayed as the norm. And Indigenous and heritage cultures and languages are not widely acknowledged or validated, and this is also evidenced by the literature. And I'll now move on to the theoretical background, beginning with this quote by Bell Hooks. "It's not the English language that hurts me, but what the oppressors do with it, how they shape it to become a territory that limits and defines, how they make it a weapon that can shame, humiliate, and colonize." So the belief system or worldview through which we language is fundamental because The English language is a dominant Western language with a colonial and assimilationist legacy. Colonial English has been imposed on non-dominant cultures and quote-unquote vernacular or inferior languages under the tenets of civilization, linguistic imperialism, and cognitive imperialism. This dominant Western thought holds a human-centered perspective, which essentializes the purpose of humans into an imperialistic control and exploitation of Earth, nature, and the human or non-human quote-unquote other. This view of English as a quote-unquote superior language can be traced back to the British Empire, where Great Britain acts as a mighty teacher. And while she sits in her matchless powers of political supremacy, commerce, wealth, and literature, these influences will combine to diffuse the language with all the excellences kindred to it throughout the whole world. And this is a quote from Reverend George in 1867. This linguistic and cognitive imperialism has led to the linguistic and ethnic genocide of peoples colonized by the British Empire. And the danger of us as language educators ignoring this colonial and assimilationist legacy resides in the human exceptionalism or the epistemological error. For example, the positivist or quote-unquote objective view of the Western human as quote-unquote superior to the rest of nature or to the quote-unquote other has led to a naive empiricism and an arrogant elitism in research and in teaching. This epistemological error, for example, dominates the current mainstream Western worldview, our institutions, our mental models, and the English language. Given the paralyzing insecurities suffered by many applied linguists vis-a-vis traditional Western linguists, the defense mechanism is to call for more quote-unquote traditional or scientific methods of teaching, which fall in line with the positivist, objectivist viewpoint. And as Lilia Bartolome says here, solutions to the general failures of the field of language education are also expected to be technical in nature. This reductionist, positivist Western language research or teaching methods of inquiry subordinate theory and knowledge, citing Giro here in 1983, to imperatives of efficiency and technical mastery, and history is reduced to a minor footnote. This lack of historical balance and consideration of social, cultural, and political context in our field has led to colonial teaching methods such as high-stakes standardized testing, or the valuing print literacy above all other forms of literacy such as digital, visual, oral literacies, and also extractive, racist Western research paradigms and methods in the pursuit of quote-unquote scholarly knowledge. This has upheld continued white epistemological supremacy and racisms, and despite the monolingual turn in applied linguistics, the languages that are largely acknowledged and are implemented in our classrooms still largely tend to be colonial, quote-unquote official nation state and or non-endangered languages. So the language we use and the worldview we enact have repercussions in how we treat our environment and those around us. Some examples here: dirt, wasteland, wildlife. For example, if we categorize traditional and respected territories as wasteland or animals as wildlife, we may become more complicit in their mistreatment. Language is inseparable from the environment, and there is a need to make language education and language more culturally and environmentally responsive. And citing Kubota here, we also need to pose deeper questions of linguistic and cultural inequalities in relation to colonialism, imperialism, capitalism, and associated language ideologies. This paper contends a more sustainable way to language would be to review the dominant neoliberal Western worldview that informs our ecologically and culturally destructive assumptions. So to avoid essentialism, not all English or colonial language speakers think or speak the same and can have an alternative worldview. However, English language speakers, educators, even unwittingly, who have enacted a colonial human-centered worldview of human exceptionalism, cognitive and linguistic imperialism, have legitimized the subjugation of non-dominant cultures and destroyed ecosystems. At a world or a macro level, the trickle-down effect of this imbalance can already be felt and seen through the impact of the human-caused climate and humanitarian crises. And at a local classroom level, learners are being viewed through a heritage language deficit lens. They are experiencing ethnic ambivalence and evasion, linguistic discrimination, whiteness, and learners being marginalized by white listening subjects. And as Gerald cautions, any educator, English language teaching or otherwise not actively disrupting the status quo of whiteness is contributing to a perpetuation of symbolic violence, and claims of neutrality supported by a focus on economic concerns or not are insufficient excuses for a failure to engage with white supremacy. So this presentation argues that major contributors to the climate and humanitarian crises and inequitable classroom environments are, first, the commodification and disembodiment of English from the environment for economic profit to meet demands of capitalism or linguistic imperialism. For example, just viewing English as a transactional, abstract code for messaging without the historical, social, and cultural context and colonial legacies. And second, the lack of education or knowledge of alternative ways of being and knowing. For example, Indigenous worldviews are rooted in the principles of reciprocity and relationships between communities and the local environment. And decolonizing Earth-centered and relational worldviews should also be equally validated in the English classroom without any one worldview being imposed. As Leinen highlights, schools reflect deeply our Western worldview, which is the underlying cause for the sustainability crisis. And the main goal of education would be to give future generations tools for thinking and seeing the world differently, constructing their own worldviews, and acting to create a sustainable future. So into practice, the Transferable Learning Circle, or TLC, views language and our learners as holistic and in relation to the environment and the past, present, and future. It also activates background schema through a heritage language pedagogy, defined here as a method through which all multicultural and multilingual learners, not only speakers of dominant non-endangered languages, can feel fully empowered and validated in an alternative, holistic, earth-centered learning process. The Transferable Learning Circle also enables critical literacy, or a process of decolonizing the mind or unlearning. And it also embraces technology and multimodality to enable deeper knowledge sharing and co-creation, epistemic unlearning, and includes diverse literacies and ways of learning, such as digital, visual, and oral. And the TLC also fosters a classroom environment which can build sustainable futures and a holistic, equitable, and safe learning and sharing space. Heritage language pedagogy therefore aims to enable all learners and educators to engage in a decolonial exchange of knowledges, emphasizing a plurality of knowledges, not only one universal Western privilege system versus another dichotomy, where we can decolonize the mind or unlearn by questioning existing mental models and assumptions, problematicize the inequities of the status quo, and pose solutions to major and urgent real-life issues, such as the climate crisis, by incorporating already existing ancestral lifeways and teachings that have existed since time immemorial. So heritage language pedagogy and the World Reviewer log. As world reviewers, learners are prompted to journal and reflect on their ongoing linguistic autobiographies or selves in relation during lesson tasks in the log. A climate crisis article written by an Australian Indigenous author is used as a material for a 5-lesson EAP unit on environment, as I mentioned before, back in 2019. And each lesson focuses in turn on the rhetorical, lexical, grammatical, and cultural aspects of the English text. So table 1 here shows the World Reviewer example unit, how we're incorporating heritage language pedagogy, and the lesson flow. So each lesson has a specific text focus. For example, lesson 1, focusing on the rhetorical function, researching the background of the author, the publisher to identify bias, reason why the text was written. Or for example here, lesson 4, focusing on the cultural, field-specific terms used by the author, such as words such as totem, what those means, and the potential lines of exploration here, access to diverse alternative worldviews, experiences, and the impact of these views in terms of addressing climate crisis issues. So at the end of each lesson, after doing rhetorical, cultural, lexical, grammatical functions, for example, learners are asked to either video record, write, or create the responses to question prompts on their World Reviewer online logs. So we used Google Doc. I also gave the opportunity for learners to just record themselves and upload it to YouTube as a way to share their insights. Example prompts can include, according to the author, what are some of the differences between Indigenous and Western knowledge systems? How does this perspective relate to your own? And some learners are encouraged to reflect on insights from their heritage languages and cultures and their own lived experiences. So here is the World Reviewer reflection log. Note that some of the questions are focused for specific lessons based on the text focus. And in these cases, the lessons are grayed out. So during our World Reviewer tasks and log, learners talked about traditional pre-colonial place names, for example, what they meant. We compared sustainable agricultural practices in heritage languages and cultures, which shared ecological insights about the land. We also discussed phrases and the framing of environment in dominant Western English discourse, such as the degradation of the environment. We evaluated the impact of the nominalization of the English noun in this case by asking, who is degrading the environment? Why is the agent missing? What effect does this have on the meaning and for accountability? We also shared ways in which we could make more earth-centered language and metaphors to talk about the environment by prompting, again, why do certain people call areas of land wasteland, desert, or dirt? How do we relate to these words and treat this land? And what would be another way of naming this land which is more respectful of and appropriate for all its inhabitants, including human, animals, and more than human entities? And just to share, there was one example of a student who did say, well, we should keep the original name for the land, the indigenous name for the land. So here at the very end of the unit in lesson 5, we brought all of these experiences together for a World Reviewer summary where everyone was invited to write or record how their experiences have or have not grown and evolved throughout the entire unit. Once this was done, or either written or recorded, we uploaded these to our class forum, and in this case we used Padlet. So the World Reviewer enabled us to learn English through an alternative decolonial lens with an aim to establish a respectful balance of worldviews. During the lessons, some other examples, learners contrasted and compared the definition of water in the English dictionary, classified as odorless or tasteless, with an understanding that water is life and water has spirit in Indigenous languages and worldviews. We also reflected on past experiences from our family's heritage, languages, and cultures, and shared and commented on these on the final after the World Reviewer summary on the Padlet. So the role of heritage language pedagogy, the TLC and World Reviewer reviews environmental, cultural, human, more than human, and land-based relationships. And these are essential to fostering a more ecocentric, sustainable, and equitable classroom. We managed to explore and learn from alternative knowledge systems such as traditional ecological knowledges, and learning about these systems helped us gain deeper insights into non-Western approaches to addressing real-world issues while learning English, or as Baptiste called this, a cross-cultural trans-systemic knowledge exchange. Some conclusions and takeaways. Decolonizing heritage language pedagogy can assist us in creating a more equitable and ecocentric classroom, stressing the broader historical, cultural, and environmental impact of languaging. Can it also help us enable a more respectful knowledge exchange and sharing among learners from diverse heritages and languages? while also enabling our learners to develop multiple literacies, such as digital, visual, oral literacies. And also enabled learners and us as educators to reflect on and or implement alternative ways of knowing and being, or as Kabora mentions here, a term critical self-reflexivity. So the World Reviewer log, an assessment of and for learning in itself, was introduced during this presentation to exemplify how heritage language pedagogy can address the cognitive and linguistic imperialism of the the colonial monolingual English classroom, validate non-dominant heritage and indigenous knowledge systems and languages, foster discussions and orientations for more environmentally and culturally responsive sustainable futures, and promote positive identity formation for all multilingual and multicultural learners. So the TLC, the World Reviewer log, and heritage language pedagogy are small examples of how we can decolonize the mind by reviewing the mental models and assumptions through which we interpret the world, decolonize English by creating and amplifying existing Earth-centered stories to live by, and move towards a more equitable, sustainable, and transformative way of viewing and interacting with the world. So carrying forward the conversation, just some forthcoming publications that I've had are coming regarding this topic. And I would also like to take a moment to acknowledge the work of all of the scholars, communities, and people who have informed this discussion today. Tapalev, miigwech, thank you so much for listening. Take care.